Good morning, good afternoon, welcome. I'm very pleased to be joined by Vaseem Khan. Vaseem, as you know, is the president for global operations at McDermott. McDermott are a major player in the oil and gas and now hydrogen industry, working on the development and construction of some of the capex and a lot of the facilities. So thanks a lot, Vaseem. Thanks for joining me again.
Thank you, Nadeem, for having me.
You're obviously going to be speaking again at the World Hydrogen Congress, or this year's is known as the World Hydrogen Week, because we've expanded to include the Derivatives Summit. We've got a lot of interest happening and starts October the 9th to the 13th. So it's been a busy year over the last year. Maybe you can give us some of your thoughts on how the market's been evolving. I remember last year you specifically spoke about how the energy transition markets and the hydrogen markets were very much a Formula One car compared to I guess traditional pace of energy infrastructure, which was more like taking a slow drive on a Sunday afternoon. So maybe things are beginning to slow down and as sort of reality bites. What are some of your thoughts?
I think, Nadeem, thank you for the question. Very interesting question. So let me just run with the Formula One analogy first. So I still believe that the energy transition projects and the hydrogen projects in particular are much more, because of the nature of the clients, are much faster in execution than our traditional oil and gas projects. The challenge is, to use the Formula One analogy, is that we don't have the three green lights yet. So, once we can get the cars off the starting block, I think these projects will run fast. The challenge we're having is getting them off of the starting block. Now, last year at this time, Nadeem, when you and I talked, and we chatted in Rotterdam as well, the US Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA, had just been announced. It had been announced about 4 weeks before the conference last October, or 6 weeks before. And there was a lot of uncertainty around how it would be implemented. But there was a lot of apprehension in Europe that the subsidies being provided were much more generous than the subsidies provided in the EU. And the feeling was that if these subsidies are actually implemented, the hydrogen market in the US would, take off much, or the trajectory would be much faster, much higher than elsewhere in the world. What has happened in the last year is that the clarity around what is clean hydrogen, and by clean hydrogen, what would qualify for the tax credits under the IRA, is still work in progress. I mean, and these are fairly simple things. So, for example, the renewable power to generate hydrogen, is it renewable power that already exists, or is it new renewable power? So in other words, this renewable power, is it going to displace renewable power, or is it new renewable power? It's these sort of clarity that we are still not, we're not quite there.
Yeah.
In the US, we've seen a very large number of projects announced, getting ready to take advantage, let's say, of the IRA. So we've seen about a 35-40% increase in the investment in hydrogen projects, or announced investments in the hydrogen projects. The challenge is that these projects are going through planning stage. Some of them are in advanced planning stage. They're getting permits. But the challenge is that they have not yet been committed, i.e. the FID, the permission to proceed, has not happened.
Yeah.
And that is because in the US, there is still a waiting game going on for how do you define the clean hydrogen.
Yeah.
But a lot of projects are in design phase. In Europe and in the rest of the world, in the Middle East, projects are moving along more or less at the same pace as been moving for the last couple of years. What we are seeing is that people are beginning to focus more on hydrogen derivatives than on pure hydrogen, with the exception of one industry, which I'll come back to. And by hydrogen derivative, it's primarily ammonia. Mm-hmm. We are seeing a lot more small and medium-sized, both, low carbon, very low carbon, and low carbon ammonia. So ammonia from the molecule route, which is what we traditionally call blue ammonia, and blue hydrogen, and ammonia from the electron route, So we are seeing that come up. The one exception, Nadine, is steel.
Mm-hmm.
So I think, and I was on a panel last year on green steel. I believe that the industry has a good business case for green steel. And steel, as you know, alongside cement, is a very hard to abate industry. It's very difficult to remove carbon emissions from steel production without substantially changing the technology. So we believe steel has a commercial business case, which is supported by regulation. So regulation being that governments across the world demanding a lower carbon footprint for the steel mills, but also because car manufacturers, white good manufacturers, the cost delta of using green steel as compared to traditionally produced steel is actually relatively low.
Yeah.
So we do see over the next 12, 24 months, next 5 years, we do see an increasing use of increasing market for hydrogen in steel. It'll start in Europe. It'll start in places like Sweden, in Belgium, in the Netherlands, in France, in Germany. So it'll start in the heart of Europe, but we will also see it grow in the US, the car industry in the US, the white goods industry in the US. And we also expect it to grow other places where energy is cheap, because again, green hydrogen needs a lot of relatively low cost energy. So where there is relatively inexpensive industry, we believe there is going to be a good market for hydrogen in steel. So as McDermott, we're very focused, which is non-traditional business for us. So it's an adjacent to us, but we are very focused on the steel industry.
Yeah, which is good. I mean, you also use a lot of steel, I guess, as well. And I mean, last year you also spoke a lot around, I guess, modularity, the need for standards, and I guess the trying to achieve as much standards as possible to allow sort of plug and play, and I guess being very focused on the cost journey and trying to get hydrogen down to that $1 per kilogram. What are some of your thoughts a year on in? Is it you still got those hard engineering challenges ahead of us? We're seeing the development of a bit more clarity around how that industry is going to develop, specifically around, I guess, modular and the modular approach to achieving those cost reductions.
To achieve cost reduction, I think there is no alternative to modular approach, especially in the 100 to 200 kTPA range for hydrogen. I think there is no alternative to that, because what is modularization? Modularization is basically arbitrage.
Mm-hmm.
It is arbitrage on labor cost. It is arbitrage on risk. So if you can move some of the design risk, some of the construction risk offsite, you've lowered your overall risk. And it's arbitrage on the technical risk. If you can commission a facility offsite, kick the tire, so to speak, make sure it works, and then bring it to site, you've got yourself a much lower risk project. And I think all financing agencies, bankers, equity holders appreciate that. So I think fabrication is going to happen. Now, fabrication will take two routes. So where you've got a coastal location or a location which you can take large modules, and by large modules, I mean modules over, let's say, 5,000 metric tons, you're going to be fabricating in relatively low-cost locations. You'll be fabricating in the Far East, in China, in Mexico, and places like that, because the advantage of large-scale fabrication is that the labor arbitrage trumps the cost of transportation. Where the location is relatively remote, where you've got to go there by barge or by truck, which is most of Europe and the Midwest in the US, and in those locations, you will have relatively small modules. You'll still have modules, but they'll be relatively small modules, which are more likely to be fabricated closer to the site. So, and it's two different skill sets, Nadine. The ability to modularize large and modularize small are actually two different skill sets.
Yeah.
The holy grail remains getting to $1 a kilogram. I remain optimistic that we are heading in that direction. because a lot of the inputs there, it's CapEx is obviously important. The cost of a project is important, but that's really driven by the cost of energy. And we are seeing a constant decline in the cost of energy, especially where energy is produced from wind, from nuclear, from solar.
Yeah.
So the holy grail of $1 a kilogram is it will happen this decade.
Yeah.
Irrespective of that, with the tax credits that are being provided by the US IRA, by the EU, and by other governments, it's making hydrogen feasible. Couple that with regulation, it's making hydrogen feasible, irrespective of the holy grail, irrespective of the dollar a kg that we all talk about.
Yeah, I mean those subsidies, and you're right that it refers also to the EU subsidy as well, which I guess was a reaction to the IRA, and certainly in terms of the largesse that's now available, I guess in Europe is certainly even larger than in the US, but that's going to act to help stimulate the industry and help the industry achieve those economies of scale, and people are still going to be interested in trying to make as much margin as possible and drive the costs down, and so it's just going to help pull the industry up in terms of maturity. Is that right?
Yeah. And one other aspect, if I could mention, Nadeem, is the contracting strategies. Let me talk about contracting strategies, and we can talk about standardization. What is very important for a nascent industry like hydrogen, like energy transition, the large high voltage substations that are being built in Europe and will be built in the US, they're being built in Taiwan, is flexibility in the contracting strategy. Because these are nascent industries, because they are relatively new, the technology is not hard. Hydrogen production is much easier than a lot of the work we do. It's actually very simple. But they are nascent industries, which means that I would very much request the developers, the operators, the NOCs, the IOCs, the likes of Shell, the likes of Equinor, and all of the developers out there, is that we need to be flexible in terms of our contracting strategy. The traditional oil and gas, natural resource strategy of a true lump sum project really doesn't work in high cost, high labor cost, well-regulated countries. So for this industry to develop, we need flexibility in contracting strategy. And we need to understand that a risk should lie with the person best able to manage the risk.
Yeah.
So if I can manage that risk better than you can manage the risk, Nabeem, I should manage it.
Yeah.
But if you can manage it better than I can manage it, then you should manage it. That's one of the golden rules, which I think we are ignoring right now.
I'm not sure I follow exactly on what you're referring to there within. I understand that obviously the term contracting, but what actually is the difference in risk that you need to apportion? Because everyone should take greater risk on the technology, or what's different about hydrogen than the oil and gas?
What is different about hydrogen is not so much the technology as where these facilities are going. These facilities are going adjacent to existing facilities. These facilities are going into relatively high cost facilities. So for me to take a lump sum risk, a construction risk, let's say, in Saudi Arabia, where the regulatory, where there's light touch regulation, labor is freely available, and labor is a relatively small component of the overall project, versus taking a risk in, just using an example, in the port of Rotterdam in the Netherlands, heavily regulated, very congested area. Labor is hard to get, hard to retain, and the percentage of construction as an overall percentage of the project is relatively high. So in Europe, the construction component of a project may be 40-45%. In the Middle East or in the Far East, it may be 10, 15, 20%. So for me to take a risk on that 15, 20% component is a very different ask than to me to take the same risk on a 45% component. Yeah. So again, without boring the audience with too much technical details, the party best able to bear the risk should take the risk.
Yeah.
And that is essential for the industry to grow.
Understood. And in terms of other I guess differences or closing remarks, as it were, the speed to market, we've seen obviously a lot of projects be announced. We're seeing a very limited amount coming through to final investment decision. We're awaiting, I guess, some of the final pieces of regulation, specifically obviously in the US around the emissions per kilogram or whatever it's going to be. What are some of the other challenges that need to be overcome for us to get the three green lights to come back to your Formula One analogy?
I think one challenge we talked about last year as well, Nadeem, is we need to bring the capex down. We need to bring the upfront cost of these facilities down. We've talked about the production cost, low cost energy, and so on. The challenge right now, and it's somewhat different, or we were on that trajectory this time last year, is that the supply chain is quite heated right now. So the costs compared to 4 years ago have gone up. So one challenge is the supply chain. The supply chain is heated in terms of price, in terms of delivery periods, which means that we need to open our supply chain base up more. We need to buy more from. I know obviously EU regulations and US regulations, they really do require or they have preferences for buying locally, but we need to acknowledge that the supply chain is very constrained. We need to investigate markets in the Far East, in China, in India. All of these places can supply the sort of products we need to build at a relatively reasonable cost. So that's obviously one additional challenge to the equation. The other challenge to the equation is that we still don't have a consensus on what we talked about last year, standardization. A standard module where we don't have to design specifically to a client's specifications. It's almost like going back to the Ford Model T. As we start the industry, let me give you a hydrogen module in any color you want, as long as it's black. Don't ask me to paint it pink or yellow or green or brown, because with the moment you do that, my cost is going to go up and I'm going to pass that cost on to you. Now, that is a very simplistic way of putting it, but what I'm trying to say is don't impose oil and gas standards on an industry which is technically very simple. So let us buy a bog standard valve rather than buy a valve which is engineered specifically to the requirements of a client. I think that is going to take considerable cost out of the product. We are moving in that direction, but it's just a message to reinforce that we need to move towards standardization. We need to move towards modularization. We need to move towards basically a plug and play approach to our products.
Yeah, and therefore as many standards or open, I guess, open platforms as possible. And the point around, I guess, welcoming the labor conducted in low income areas such as China, as you mentioned, are probably also facing those challenges of we've seen geopolitics and indeed the exposure of some of the long supply chains due to COVID. So maybe there is now a reaction to certainly made in China. But yeah, it's going to be interesting, fascinating to see how the industry overcomes these challenges. Certainly lots of challenges to overcome, but yeah, overall quite positive around the general trajectory of how the industry's developed. The traditional pathway, I guess, of industries is I guess a bit of irrational exuberance, and that's followed by the trough of disillusionment, and then you come up into the sunlit pastures of some well-worked commercially efficient projects. Is that how you see the next sort of year panning out, or 2 years?
I believe so, Nadeem. Yeah, I think I wouldn't say we're not. I think a realism is beginning to set in. People do realize that it's not going to be what we saw 2-3 years ago, solution to all of our ills. It's not going to be. However, the realism is also allowing us to separate separate the good project from the bad projects. And as I said, There are certain industries, steel is one of them, hydrogen as a source of sustainable aviation fuels is another one of them. There are certain industries which can stand on their own with relatively minimal assistance from regulatory authorities or from tax credits. So yeah, I mean, in our case, we are still very bullish on hydrogen.
Mm-hmm.
We believe sustainable aviation fuel. We believe decarbonizing steel. We believe lower carbon fuels by substituting gray hydrogen for blue hydrogen in traditional fuel production. All of those are areas where there is going to be relatively midterm, short-term gains. Hydrogen as a transportation fuel, I think from a technical point of view, the molecule route as opposed to the electron route, that argument is going to continue.
Yeah.
So there is room for hydrogen in transportation, but I would put steel, synthetic aviation fuels, ammonia production, substitute for gray hydrogen in traditional fuel production ahead of probably transportation.
Yeah. Understood. Many thanks, Vaseem. Thanks a lot for sharing your thoughts. It was fascinating. You always make some great valid points, and we thank you and the McDermott team for your support. World Hydrogen Congress, indeed World Hydrogen Week, as is now known, and we look forward to seeing you come October the 9th to the 13th. Many thanks.
Thank you, Nadeem. Thank you for having me.
Cheers. Take care.
Cheers, Billy.